As Christians, our relationship with death is quite strange. In some way, we do everything we can to acknowledge that we are not the masters of life. We oppose, whenever possible, euthanasia, abortion, we oppose suicide, whatever it is, because we understand that life is a gift. It is something given to us that we might live fully and vibrantly, and we are not in control of life. And yet, at the same time, we also embrace our deaths, whenever they might show up, whenever they might occur, because we are also not afraid of death. We understand that in some way our faith allows us to see beyond the power of death and into the power of God and into the future, the afterlife. We hear of this in our readings today. When the apostles are in that boat with Jesus and a big storm arises, they cry out because they're afraid that they're going to die. And Jesus chastises them, rightly so. And he says, "Where is your faith?" The apostles had faith. They had enough faith to know that they could call on Jesus and he would do something to save them. But what they thought saving meant was that Jesus could prevent them from death. But they did not understand that Jesus could also bring them back to life. Abraham understood this. We hear this in our first reading from Hebrews. We hear that Abraham, when he was asked to sacrifice Isaac, he offers his son up. He goes to take Isaac to the mountain. But because of his faith, he is able to reason, we hear. He reasoned that God was able to raise even from the dead. Even before the resurrection was heard of, Abraham had this faith in God, that if God made a promise to him that he would have many descendants, and Isaac was his only son, even if Isaac were to die, Isaac could be raised back from the dead by God himself. And so Abraham had no fear in following God. He had no fear facing the death of his son. He knew that God would prevail. He knew that God would be faithful. And this is what we are called to as Christians. We live in a culture of death, a culture which strangely embraces death in many ways. It encourages, as we have said, euthanasia, abortion, suicide, all these kinds of things. And yet at the same time, we live in a culture that is afraid of death. So many people are afraid of what is going to be on the other side. And many do not believe that there is another side. They don't believe that there is anything after this life. And that thought of nothing can sometimes bring about despair, can bring about meaninglessness. But for those of us who have faith, for those of us who are able to see behind the curtain, so to speak, who are able to see behind the veil of this life and into the future, into heaven, we have a kind of peace about death. Because whenever it arises, whenever it shows up at our door, whenever we have to face death, as painful as it may be, as untimely as it may be, whatever the circumstances are, we understand and we have faith in a God who can not only save us from death, but who can even bring us back to life after death. And not just an ordinary life, but to a life that is eternal, to a life that is glorified, to a life that is pure happiness. And so our embrace of death is not an embrace of the culture of death, but our embrace of death is an embrace of someone who understands that God is there, who understands that this is not something I love, but the one I love can bring me back from this reality, can bring me back from this suffering, and can restore me to life, a life fuller than I have ever known. And so we are not afraid. As we live in our culture today, especially during these difficult times, let us remember that. We need not be guided by fear. We need not be overcome by fear, but by faith. And we have to understand that the faith that we have is in a God who is all-powerful, almighty, who is the Lord of life, who has the power to give us life even after death. Let us put our faith in him. Let us trust him, and let us not be afraid.